For 2,000 years, humanity has been searching for Atlantis. People have looked for it on the ocean floor, among desert formations, beneath layers of ice, and inside legends that outlived entire civilizations. Researchers have scanned the seabed, studied ancient maps, compared texts, and pored over satellite imagery. And yet, no single location has ever offered a convincing answer. As time passed, the amount of data kept growing, and it became harder to understand how all these pieces were connected. Geology, terrain, climate patterns, ancient descriptions, they all seem to exist on different planes. To look at them simultaneously, we combined everything into one dataset and handed it to an artificial intelligence for analysis. The AI wasn't searching for Atlantis, it was simply comparing facts. And within that comparison, something unexpected appeared. Several independent parameters that converged on a single point. A point that matches Plato's description more closely than any other place on Earth. Suddenly, the central question changed. Is this the trace of a vanished civilization, or just a rare coincidence that remained unnoticed for 2,000 years? The story of Atlantis is one of the most persistent mysteries to survive into our time. All we truly have are a few pages of ancient text. Yet somehow, these pages endured for thousands of years. And they still raise questions. Not because they tell a beautiful tale of a sunken island, but because too many details sound as if they were based on something real. What's surprising is that similar stories appear far beyond Greece. Across cultures, from the Mediterranean to the Americas, we find myths about lands that vanished after a devastating catastrophe. Tales of cities built with precise geometry, of peoples erased by a force of nature. And today, no one can say with certainty where myth ends and where the memory of an ancient event begins. If we look at Atlantis not as a legend, but as a possible trace of a real disaster, one simple question emerges. Could fragments of something that once existed be hidden within all this information? That's why we gathered everything known about Atlantis. Plato's writings, ocean geology, ancient climate models, satellite imagery, underwater maps, tectonic data. A massive, scattered collection of facts no human could assess fully by hand. We passed this entire dataset to an artificial intelligence, not to prove the myth, but to see whether there was any internal logic in the data at all. The algorithm doesn't offer interpretations. It simply shows where coincidences are stronger than they should be by chance. And it was these coincidences that pushed us to continue the investigation. To understand just how far these clues might lead, we had to begin with the central question: how real could the story be that Plato wrote down 2,500 years ago? The first question: could Atlantis have been real? Everything we know about Atlantis begins in one place: Plato's texts. Plato wasn't a historian. He was a philosopher who used stories to express ideas. But in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, his description of Atlantis is unusually specific. There are dates, distances, measurements, details about climate, canals, even the layout of the city. It doesn't read like typical mythology, and it doesn't resemble a metaphor, which is usually written without geographical precision. According to Plato, the story reached him through a long chain, from Egyptian priests to Solon, then to Solon's family, and only afterward, to Plato himself. The tale passed through centuries, yet somehow preserved surprisingly detailed descriptions. What could that mean? There are three classic interpretations. The first: Plato invented Atlantis entirely, a moral allegory about a powerful nation destroyed by its own arrogance. The second: he based it on real ancient events, but transformed them so heavily that the story became a philosophical narrative rather than a historical one. And the third: behind the legend may lie the memory of an actual civilization or a natural catastrophe that happened long before Greece existed. Each version sounds plausible, but none of them explains all the details at once. That's why we turn to artificial intelligence. not to choose the correct version, but to analyze how the structure of Plato's text compares to other myths. We asked the algorithm to compare Atlantis with 112 ancient legends about sunken lands, destroyed cities, and vanished peoples. The AI found something interesting. Most myths rely on symbols and imagery, following the same emotional pattern over and over. Atlantis is different. Its narrative structure is closer to an eyewitness account than to myth. There are almost no metaphors, but there are many technical details, the kind usually found in traditions rooted in real observations. This doesn't prove Atlantis existed, but it suggests that Plato's story may be more than a philosophical invention. And if he was indeed retelling someone else's account, the next logical question becomes, what real place could have inspired that story? The second question, where could Atlantis have been? If we assume that Plato's story might contain traces of a real event, the next question is both the simplest and the hardest. Where exactly could Atlantis have been located? Over the last 2,000 years, dozens of locations have been proposed. But once you strip away theories and romantic assumptions, something becomes clear. Almost every version rests on one or two coincidences, and just as many contradictions. To sort this out, we collected the most popular candidates and handed them to an artificial intelligence. The algorithm doesn't care which theory is trendy or which one sounds more dramatic. It evaluates only parameters: landscape shape, climate, geology, distances, time layers, and how well they match the details in Plato's text. Here's what we tested. The first candidate: the Atlantic Ocean and the Azores. Scientific expeditions have indeed found signs of collapsed underwater plateaus there. But the seafloor topography doesn't really match the concentric ring layout, and the climate doesn't fit the environment Plato describes. The AI flagged this version as partially matching, but with serious discrepancies. The second candidate: the Mediterranean and the Minoans. After the eruption of Santorini, this became one of the most popular ideas. But the Minoans didn't live beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Their cities followed a different layout, and the timelines don't match. The AI classified this as a symbolic parallel, not a factual one. The third candidate: the Caribbean. Underwater terraces, geometric seafloor shapes, unusual depths. Visually, it's very intriguing. But when compared to Plato's description, there are too many mismatches. Climate, scale, location. The AI registered a high level of visual resemblance, but a weak geographical basis. The fourth candidate: Antarctica. One of the most spectacular ideas, and one of the least realistic. Neither the ancient climate, nor the timescale, nor the known geological processes support a link between Antarctica and Atlantis. The AI discarded this version almost immediately based on time and terrain criteria. The fifth candidate: Northwest Africa. For a long time, this region was barely mentioned, but the Sahara's past climate was completely different: green, humid, full of rivers and lakes. There are structures here that don't fit neatly into familiar models, and they produced more matches in the AI's analysis than any other region. When the algorithm compared all these versions across dozens of parameters, it highlighted only one area where the number of matches significantly outweighed the contradictions. Not a perfect match, but the most reasonable one among all candidates. To understand why this region stood out, we have to look more closely at the details in Plato's description. Those details became the key to the next step of our investigation. If we set emotions aside and look at Atlantis as the possible trace of an ancient event, the main tool isn't imagination, it's detail. Details are what determine whether Plato's text can be connected to a real place at all. His description contains several elements that stand out sharply, and these became the foundation of the AI's analysis. Not symbols, not ideas, but specific, testable characteristics. The first and most unusual detail is the shape of the city: concentric rings of land and water. For a myth, it's an oddly complex design. For real geography, it's extremely rare. Structures like this hardly ever occur in nature, especially at the scale Plato describes. But he insists on these rings as the defining feature. The second detail is scale. Plato gives proportions: the diameter of the rings, the width of the canals, the spacing between them. For a long time, these numbers were treated as exaggerations or metaphors. But even if we see them as distorted memories, they still offer a reference point, not exact measurements, but ratios. Not perfect matches, but similar patterns. The third detail is the surrounding landscape. Plato describes a vast rectangular plain encircling the city, crisscrossed by canals. Such geometry is rare in nature, but the idea of a plain paired with an unusual landform is something we can test. The AI treated this parameter as one of the most important anchors. The fourth detail is climate and resources. Atlantis is portrayed as a place rich in water, fertile soil, vegetation, and even uncommon metals. Interpretations vary, but one thing is clear. It wasn't a land of perpetual cold, and it wasn't a desert. At least not at the time Plato refers to. The fifth detail is its position beyond the Pillars of Heracles, modern Gibraltar. It's usually taken literally, but the phrase might have meant a direction rather than a precise point. Geography in antiquity was flexible. Still, we gave this clue to the AI as a directional reference. The interesting part began when the AI compared all these characteristics to real environments, not one by one, but in combination. Because matching one or two details can be coincidence, but all five aligning starts to raise questions. The algorithm did what is nearly impossible to do manually. It scanned thousands of landforms, climate zones, and geological structures, comparing them to Plato's checklist. And within all the mismatches, it identified one type of landscape that unexpectedly matched several of those criteria at once. Not a location yet, but a specific kind of environment, one that appears extremely rarely, and one Plato could have been describing based on second-hand accounts or long-preserved memory. This analytical step became the key to the next phase of the investigation, searching for the one real structure that fits these characteristics better than any other. The place itself. When the AI compared all the parameters, terrain shape, proportions, ancient climate, geology, and Plato's clues, it identified a type of landscape that is extremely rare. But one specific region stood out. Not because it matched perfectly, but because it matched too well for the similarity to be accidental. And this place isn't on the ocean floor. It isn't near Greece. It isn't even in the part of the world where researchers have been searching for the last century. The AI led us to the center of the Sahara Desert, to a vast circular formation often called the Eye of the Sahara. The Risha structure. Seen from above, it's a 40-kilometer wide circle split into concentric rings, so precise and so symmetrical that many people mistake it for an artificial construction the first time they see it. But it's a natural formation, an enormous geological dome shaped over tens of millions of years. Still, its form was exactly what caught the AI's attention. Plato describes an island built around concentric rings of land and water. Risha is composed of the same rings, eroded, ancient, monumental, yet strikingly similar in geometry to the pattern in the text. Next, the proportions. Plato's measurements were long dismissed as exaggerations. But when you compare not the exact numbers but the ratios, the similarities become unnervingly close. The size of Risha's central area relative to its outer ring mirrors the proportions in Plato's account. Then, the surroundings. Plato mentions a large plain surrounding the capital of Atlantis. Today, Risha is surrounded by desert. But 12,000 years ago, this was a different world. Rivers, lakes, savanna, vegetation. The Sahara was green. Paleoclimate data, which we also fed into the AI, supports this. And according to those parameters, the region unexpectedly fits what Plato's source might have been describing. Next, metals and resources. The legend refers to unusual metals and rare materials. Risha is surrounded by mineral deposits and ore concentrations uncommon in other parts of Africa. And finally, the location. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles has always been interpreted as pointing toward the Atlantic, but taken more broadly as outside the known maritime world of ancient Greece. Northwest Africa fits the description. The AI, unaware of human geographic traditions, treated this clue simply as a directional range. And Risha fell within that range. None of these matches proves anything on its own. But taken together, the Rishat structure became the only location on Earth where the shape, proportions, ancient climate, and geological history align closely enough for the legend to even be plausible. It doesn't mean Rishat is Atlantis, but it does mean that among all the examined possibilities, it is the only one that matches the description better than chance would predict. And that's why our investigation continues here. To answer a single question: could a civilization like the one Plato described have truly existed in this place? The Sahara, we don't remember. It's difficult to imagine, but just 12,000 years ago, the Sahara was one of the greenest regions on Earth. Not a desert, but a savanna, with large lakes, rivers, wildlife, and a climate closer to the tropics than to the arid landscape we know today. This isn't speculation, it's established paleoclimate science. But something else is far more intriguing. This period aligns almost perfectly with the date of the catastrophe given by Plato. The coincidence doesn't prove anything on its own, but it sets a direction. We asked the AI to compare ancient climate models of the region with Plato's description of Atlantis's natural resources: fertile soil, abundant water, a warm climate, the ability to build canals. All of it aligns surprisingly well with the Sahara during its green period. The AI highlighted a key idea. If the legend reflects the Sahara of its greener past, then the disappearance of a major settlement wouldn't have been caused by an oceanic flood, as often imagined. It could have been the result of a combination of climate collapse and geological activity, the kind of long-term shift that slowly turned a thriving region into a place where human life became impossible. But even this isn't enough. Plato describes a sudden catastrophe, a day when the ground itself fell into the sea. Could something in the heart of Africa produce an event that would look exactly like that? What the landscape is hiding. When we looked at the Rishat structure through the eyes of a geologist, one thing became clear. Its history is far less calm than it appears. Fault lines, redirected riverbeds, traces of ancient lakes. Everything suggests that this region went through periods of rapid change, and those periods could easily form the basis of a legend about a sudden catastrophe. We fed the AI data on soil composition, erosion patterns, and the region's ancient climate. The algorithm wasn't searching for a city. It was looking for signs that an event similar to the one Plato described could have happened here. And it found a simple but important pattern. Around Rishat, there are areas where water levels in the past changed far too abruptly for normal climate cycles. In some places, the erosion marks indicate fast, powerful flows, strong enough to destroy settlements within hours. To the people living here thousands of years ago, that would have looked exactly like the ground collapsing into water. But what came next was even more intriguing. Across several zones along Rishat's rings, the AI identified geometric anomalies. Not ruins. Time would have erased those, but shapes nature rarely produces on its own. A nearly perfect arched segment, a straight line stretching almost a kilometer, and a patch of ground with a density sharply different from everything around it. Individually, these features could be coincidence. Together, they form a pattern, one that resembles the spatial layout of a large settlement: canals, foundations, fortifications, or their long eroded remnants. We asked the AI to estimate the likelihood that this pattern appeared naturally. Its answer came in lower than the typical background probability for structures of this kind. Not proof, not a revelation, but the moment when scattered data points stop being random noise and start forming a hint. The only question now is what that hint points to: a long-lost settlement destroyed by catastrophe, or one of the most convincing geological illusions on the planet? The conclusion we didn't expect. Artificial intelligence doesn't dramatize. Its conclusions are dry, but sometimes that dryness is what makes them unsettling. When we asked the algorithm to estimate how likely it was that the Risha structure, its shape, proportions, ancient climate, geological processes, and local anomalies, matched Plato's description purely by chance, it produced a range. According to the AI, the probability that the Rishat region coincidentally aligns with Plato's key criteria is between 6 and 12%. Not proof, but an unusually low number, one that's difficult to ignore. Then came the second part of the calculation. The AI evaluated the probability that a large prehistoric culture could have existed in this region, only to disappear due to climate collapse and geological change. Its estimate, about 48%. Not Atlantis, not a civilization of gods, but a real earthly society that lived in the green Sahara and vanished when the climate turned this land back into desert. And here's what stands out. The AI noted that Plato's story could reflect the long distorted memory of an actual tragedy, carried through generations, reshaped by retellings, and eventually translated into the language of myth. If that's the case, then Atlantis wasn't a city swallowed by the ocean. It was the story of a people lost beneath shifting sands. As we closed this investigation, one thing became clear. We did not find Atlantis, but we came closer to understanding why the legend endures. Artificial intelligence doesn't search for meaning. It searches for patterns. And within the data, it found a combination of landscape, climate, processes, and anomalies that align more often than randomness should allow. So we asked it one last question. What is the probability that the Atlantis legend is based on a real event, even if heavily distorted over time? The answer, approximately 62%. Not as a revelation, but as a measured assessment that behind the ancient myth, there may indeed be a real historical trace. And perhaps that's what makes Atlantis such a powerful mystery. Not the idea that it sank, but the fact that its memory survived civilizations and still compels us to search. Because somewhere beneath the layers of time, the truth may still exist, even if it's long been buried by sand.